My name is Christine Kirkpatrick. I'm from the San Diego Supercomputer Center, where I'm Division Director of Research Data Services and where we host the GoFair US office. I'm delighted to have Professor Dr. Mirjam van Reisen here with me today to talk about VODAN-Africa and their efforts for the training of trainers. I don't know if it's okay to call it TAUT, but you'll have to tell us how to pronounce the acronym. She is Professor of Computing for Society at Leiden University and Professor of International Relations, Innovation and Care at Tilburg University. She leads the organization EEPA in Brussels and is chair of the Globalization, Accessibility, Innovation and Care Network. This is the first of a four-part series. This is the second week in a four-part series. Last week we heard from Professor Dr. Baron Mons, who gave us an introduction to the Virus Outbreak Data Network. And then next week, after today's webinar, next week we will have Albert Mons and Luis Bonino talk about one of the VODAN projects, which is Data Work in Action. And we have a really exciting webinar capping the end of the series, which has three different projects showing how mining all sorts of different data sets is helping in the fight against COVID-19. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Mirjam, and again, just let me know as you'd like me to advance slides.
Thank you very much, Christina, and it's just really great that you are hosting this series, and I'm also really excited to see so many of our group from all over the world really today at this webinar. Thank you everybody for joining. And yes, we had already done quite a bit of work before this situation on COVID-19 started. In 2014, some of us were really involved in the situation in Liberia around the Ebola crisis. And one of the takeaways from that was that it was just really frustrating on how little preparedness there was, and also how much was put into resolving the crisis. And then when the crisis was declared over, everything kind of was taken away, and there was really no capacity remaining for any future epidemic. So we thought we really could do this differently. And so I've been working with the team of Barent and GoFair, and my concern has really always been, how can we make sure that especially countries with weaker perhaps health systems, and also not with a natural base around data science, how we can make sure that there is accessibility to this innovation. And so the Virus Outbreak Data Network, VODAN, or as we like to say sometimes, the Virus Outbreak Data Africa Network, is a response to that. But here today on the call, we also have some of my students from Kazakhstan, from Indonesia, from China. So this is really part of the international response. So then maybe if you go to the next slide, Christina. I wanted to talk today about what are the core objectives. What is it that we're trying to achieve? Why is the training of trainers so essential, so much the core of the establishment of a fair internet of data and services? And then finally, what are really some of the immediate next steps that can now be taken, and where we are really, I think, at this point now leading the innovation. So maybe if we start at the next slide on the objectives, looking at the objectives, and the next slide. Well, this is an article that was published this week on Monday, because we see that there is just such a phenomenal amount of resources going into a data science approach to COVID-19, and really a completely international approach, because we are here all dealing with the same epidemic. One of the developments that has happened in the European Union is that already the European Commission had declared that it was not really right for so much public funding to go into science without treating data, the results of it, as a public resource. So in Europe, from the perspective of science, we already have an acceptance that we do need a handling of data that is conscious of the value of those data and the need to be able to treat them as a valuable resource. But in the context of the COVID-19 approach, not all of these principles have actually yet been put in place. And part of that is also because it requires understanding. And maybe if we go to the next slide then, the very important key issues that we are trying to resolve through the Internet of Fair data and services is, first of all, that well, we are dealing with an incredible increasing amount of digital data in general, but also digital data related to health. We are also dealing with an incredibly fast growing increase of publications. If you just look at the publications on COVID, we are now within our group, one of our colleagues is analyzing 47,000 scholarly articles on COVID alone. So, you know, we just know that it's impossible to go through that amount of literature just by reading. So we really need to adapt our ways of looking at this. Then the other problem that we are trying to solve here is that the internet as we know it, it was actually really not designed in a purposeful way. And one of the results of that is that the internet is really very much an instrument for humans to share information, to find information. But from a machine perspective, the internet is a nightmare. So the question that we need to ask now that we are getting this vast amount of data is really how the machine can also help us to go through these data and to make sure that we are able to find quality data in this way that then can inform further development in tooling through AI and other tools. And for that, the solution that FAIR has put forward, actually since a Lawrence workshop was held in 2014 in our university at Leiden, is that there are really basically four essentials that we need to organize. And that is that data, first of all, have to be discoverable. We call that findable. They need to be accessible, but accessibility has to be organized within a context of understanding the sensitivity about these data, understanding that data are part of regulatory frameworks of sovereignties where these data are produced, but that there really is a possibility with those conditions to make data interoperable and make them reusable. And so this is really what constitutes the basis of the Internet of Fair data and services. And as it happens, from the 1st of January 2020, all science in Europe was conditioned to making the data that are collected within the context of science and produced in the context of science, that they are handled according to these FAIR principles and will be the basis of the Internet of Fair data and services. So these are the problems that we're trying to resolve. If we then go to the next slide, Christina, then you find here that the four principles have very specific tasks behind them. And we'll get to those tasks in the remainder of the presentation. We can go to the next slide. So here with this graph, we basically show the three essentials. We need to have an Internet of Fair data and services that can produce for society. We first of all need quality data. Secondly, we need computing instruments, and then we need tools. And so one of the very important elements of the Internet of Fair data and services is that we accept, and actually we take it as the principle, that data are managed and stewarded within their location of origin. And that means that it is a completely different way from the system where data are taken away, are then put in data warehouses and then analyzed. Here we're saying, no, the data that are stewarded within the location where they are produced, that is how we can assure that these data have quality, that we can find the provenance, the origin of these data, and that also allows us to investigate the data, putting them back within the specific context where they are produced. It also actually is a very good way of ensuring that we can find fake data, because data that really don't correspond with the data as we are finding them within the magnitude, the volume of data that will be available, can then easily be traced to their origin, and lacking origin will then further ensure that we can ask further questions to ensure those data and verify them. So the principle here really is to establish a connected internet based on the principle of data sovereignty, and recognizing that the data are handled and have to be handled within the legal context in which they are produced. And that is a good thing, because that also recognizes that data belong somehow to the organizations, to the administrations, to the place where these data are produced, and where they relate back to the data subjects. And so the task of the Internet of Fair data and services is really to make sure that this distributed resource of data connects under clearly defined conditions. That then means that it is the algorithms that will visit the data, and that is where also the governance around the algorithm and understanding the auditing, the basis for the algorithm becomes a very important task in the building of the Internet of Fair data and services. So if we go to the next slide then, Christina. Why is this virus outbreak data network such an important benefit for Africa? Also, I'd say many countries in Asia and elsewhere, is that really it avoids that digital data are removed to warehouses elsewhere. So the control and the ownership really remains within the place where they are produced and where they are stewarded. It therefore really ensures data ownership and handling. It also will really strengthen the health systems, because within the health systems, in all kinds of ways, within a hospital, within a Ministry of Health, within a medics department at the university, these data are a resource for analytics. And finally, it will strengthen the understanding and the capacity to deal with digital data as a resource. And this will strengthen the capacity for data stewardship, and also for producing tools that are relevant to a particular place and to particular questions that are relevant within each of the participants within the Internet of Fair Data and services. So then going to the next slide. This is now where the importance comes in of training. And really the training is in one way a, well, transfer of understanding, but really in essence it is building a community in which there is a common understanding of the purpose. And that is really a critical part of the whole project, because if we go to the next slide, the way in which we go forward is that the data are really handled within a way that makes sense to the particular situation, that makes sense to the particular context. So in our case, we have started our work with looking at establishing a fair data point in Uganda, which will serve Uganda, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, and Nigeria in the next phase. We will also establish fair data points in those countries. And in fact, today I also heard that Tunisia will be joining our efforts. We have, in the next step, identified really that since capacity building and the organization of knowledge is such an important part of this, is that it's really important to establish training of trainers hubs and to include universities within those efforts as critical places where this training can take place and become really part of the curricula of data science, computer science, informatics, but also interdisciplinary serves the other disciplines. In step 3, very important step, recognizing that we are doing this in the context of incredible efforts at the moment by ministries of health, in the context of the fight against COVID, and that really this has to be something that contributes to those efforts and doesn't take the much needed capacities away. And also that within the leadership and the ministries of health, it's understood what we are trying to do here, and that this really gives and will continue to give ownership over data stewardship and data analytics to the administration as well. We also really have to involve and build trust with the hospitals and the clinics, especially if we include, and that is what we are doing, the data as they're produced within the hospital and the clinics. That's very trustworthy because these data are the closest to what has been recorded by the medics in terms of how they have treated the patients. But it also means that the hospitals and clinics really have to understand the purpose of what we are doing and are fully part of that. And I'm really happy to say that in the current setup, we have the highest levels of the hospitals in the countries involved, and they have involved both their clinicians, but also the people working on the data in the training of trainers. And so from there, having explained, we have to then also really concretize and lay down how we deal with those relationships, establish relationships that are accountable and that are trustworthy for everybody involved. If you go to the next slide. Part of the job has been to set up the information channels with the ministries of health, the bureaus of health, and really get an ongoing working relationship with every level. So we need a political level because the political level really needs to endorse what we do, but we also need to relate to all the levels where people are dealing with the COVID crisis, are dealing with the whole exercise of data stewardship and data analytics, and ask questions to them in terms of how they are best served, but also respond to concerns that they have. And so at the end of the day, it really serves us very well if we can have the endorsements as we have now of the private secretary, of the Minister of Health in Uganda, and also from the Bureau of Health from the region Tigray in Ethiopia. And that really empowers the community to go forward and to serve the fight against COVID-19. So going to the next slide. We then need, having had the endorsement, we then really need to understand the governance and the regulatory framework. And again, these might be different in each situation, and they will be different, and they should be different, because these are responding to a particular context. And so in our training, we have set up a document for research and questions where our trainers have now gone out to the hospitals and really determine what needs to be part of our understanding of the governance and regulatory framework. And again, part of this exercise is to include the ministries of health and the responsibilities that they hold. So maybe going to the next slide. So these are some of the questions. I think that the slides will be distributed, so you'll be able to see all of this. Going to the next. Here then we have set out the task for compiling the information flowcharts, and then if you go to the next slide, well, here you see, of course, kind of our classical repositories, which then are digitalized, but they are not digitalized in such a way that they would be machine readable. So part of the task is to make sure that we work with the documents as they are. In this context, we propose that we will work with the response form by the WHO for COVID, which actually interlinks quite well with other existing tools. We take the tool from the hospital or clinic as it is. We're not going to change it. We take the categories that are relevant for COVID, and then we the task is to produce a machine-readable backend to it, RDF, that would allow the computer to find these data and to visit them, obviously, again, under the very stringent conditions that are in place for accessibility. So going to the next slide. And just by the way, this kind of process from pen and paper to digital to machine readable, that is something that needs to happen everywhere. We actually found that also in the context of Italy, a lot of the basic recording was done with pen and paper. So here, this is the different expertise that needs to be involved to establish a COVID-19 data community. So this is, on the one hand, the establishment of the FAIR data point. This is really the officials in health administration who are responsible for governance and regulatory framework that need to be respected, the health professionals who need to understand the information flows and data handling and need to lead on that, and then the data scientists who create the semantic data modeling, and also the interdisciplinary data stewards who can really, from the different fields, engage with the ontologies that are within the data and that need to be understood and changed in such a way that they are ready for machine readability. And then in the subsequent phase, that is really where the tools can go over the existing internet to visit the data, always through the FAIR data point where the accessibility is arranged, and where we will be then looking at the machine learning, artificial intelligence, and text mining tooling, where the auditing of the algorithms becomes very important, that these can be trusted. Where we also need experts in legal knowledge to understand the regulatory embedding of the use of the FAIR data point, and of course clinicians and health analysts who are critical for the health data analytics. And finally, the experts, like in our case on COVID-19, we really need the experts in the field to formulate the hypothesis, but also once the data produce certain cardinal assertions, to really see how these can be tested and taken forward, so that we understand the meaning of the knowledge that is produced through data science, data analytics, and that this is properly tested and taken through the proper procedures before it can then be judged as implementable or advice for further implementation. So going to the next slide. Now the last part that I think is important to consider is where are we going from here? So we are now clear within the context of the training what needs to happen. What are some of the next steps that we are looking at still as part of the training? The training being essential to the realization of the Internet of Fair Data and services. So going to the next. Here you see you see here the FAIR principles. We have seen an earlier slide where these were set out, and these are color-coded in red and blue. So at the moment, the technical development team in GoFair is working on all the elements that are red. And that is the technical specification of what will constitute a FAIR data point. And so in parallel is the process that we are working on in the training of trainers, where we're really working with local authorities on the governance and regulations through which we can define accessibility, and the domain specialists through which we can organize the modeling. And so with all of that, we are really combining the technical with the creation of a community. And that community is taking decisions in each particular context where the community needs to answer two critical questions: that data should be as open as possible, but also as closed as necessary. And what that means will differ in each substance community. It's different if you answer that question for in a medical context or in another domain context. And also it's different whether you ask this question in this place or in that place, because there are different cultures around what is possible and right according to that particular environment in terms of how data can be used and should be used. So this has to be contextualized. And again, for everybody, it means that the data will be distributed, but they will be as distributed as possible and as centralized as necessary. So in the end, you can actually see the Internet of Fair Data and Services as a connection of all kinds of places where data are held, including perhaps even our phone, And so this is again a spectrum of distribution and centralization, where as a community, decisions need to be made in terms of what is the best balance between distribution and centralization of the data. Going then to the next slide. So here you see the two elements coming together. On the left-hand side, you see the work in the hospital, the data entry, putting them into the appropriate forms, the data storage, which is still in the hospital. And then you see the work of the data steward, where through the data modeling on the one hand and through the definition of the metadata, the data are prepared to relate to the FAIR data point. Again, to emphasize, the data are not moved. The data remain where they are, but the FAIR data point will be the central place where the metadata relate to, where therefore the metadata about the existence of the data can be found. And kind of a minimum proposition could be that you have data, you don't want these data to be accessible under any condition for direct machine readability, but on the metadata there is a phone number of a particular desk in the hospital where permission can be asked to enter the data. So by way of illustrating that putting up the metadata does not give you direct accessibility. Every level of closure of the data is still possible within the publication of the metadata. The only thing that the metadata does is that it announces that the data are there. And so the underlying levels of accessibility, they need to be defined, and that is part of the process of building the community, and where the training is essential, taking ourselves through the training. We are meeting those questions and then have to engage within our community to give some of the answers. Then quickly going to the next, and then we should really open up for questions. Here you see at the bottom, you see the records of the patient data. The process of verification then makes them in principle possible for machine readability. They're stored, you see the places of storage there, and then these are announced through the metadata in the FAIR data point. And depending on the accessibility that is given within the metadata, the machine knows whether it can visit the data and what the conditions are. And so through the algorithm, this process is then automatized, which makes it very important that the algorithms are audited and can be trusted. So going to the next slide then. Yeah, clearly there is no FAIR data point without machine actionable metadata. So the metadata are really the core of a FAIR data point, and the FAIR data points are the hubs from which the Internet of FAIR data and services is being constructed. Then going to the next. This is again to emphasize that the job that we are working on is really at the core of building this COVID-19 relevant internet of FAIR data, and then the tooling in the services where the domain experts and the metadata experts together are able to create machine actionable metadata that are in compliance and relevant to the context where this community is located. Then going to the next. So these are some of the critical questions that we will need to go through. And so within the training, that is what we are really going to do in the machine for metadata for machine workshops, and where these questions in a logical way need to be addressed and given an answer to, and from there then we can construct the fair data point. Going to the next. So then to summarize, the aim of the work here is to make data available, such an important resource. That doesn't mean that they are open. Personal data should always be protected, and I think basically under every circumstance. However, the interoperability is possible also when we protect personal data. But how we make the data interoperable depends on how we embed this in local regulatory frameworks, local also meaning national, depending on the level and the context in which we are working. Then we need to maximize the freedom to operate. So that means that really our work needs to be additional to the work that is already being implemented in the hospitals and the clinics, and it should not add other pressures. And we want, therefore, to use the data recordings that are in place in the medical facilities, but make them relevant to our COVID-19 context. We will be always building on any tools anywhere already available that contribute to what we are doing. So never reinvent the wheel is really an important principle. Ensuring transparency and auditing of the algorithmic tools is very important, because all of this has an important element in that we really need to be able to trust the operations that are going to take place. And from there, well, creativity can come in. So many new tools can be developed and they can be appropriate to location and to purpose. And the last principle is that we need to always be very careful to make sure that any assertions that may come out are triangulated, and that we trust the experts in the field and make sure that that involvement is always there to put the conclusions that may come from the data analytics, to put them to the test, and really not to jump to conclusions too fast. Already we are seeing too much of that in the current time, coming from very high levels. So from science, we need to really make sure that that step of triangulation is also part of our way of working. So with that, Christine, going to the last slide, I think this is how you can reach all of us. The coordinator is Francisca. She's here in this call. She's based at Kampala International University. The technical support group is led by Mirjam. She's a PhD student on this topic at Leiden University, also associated with Kampala International University. And our ambassadors of Go Fair is led by another student of ours, Alia, who is based in Kazakhstan and was one of the first to establish a fair data point, which was not published, but which was very well done. And then we should also thank the Go Fair International Support and Coordination Office. They have a fantastic team, and Eric Schultes is also available all the time for any one of us to advise and to make sure that we know the best way forward, and that all our efforts are very well coordinated. So I also wanted to thank him here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. I found myself taking a lot of notes with thoughts. So anyway, it was, hopefully I wasn't slow to advance your slides. There were so many thought-provoking things that I had to remember I was moderating.
You're not getting badly.
So while people are formulating their questions, I wanted to give you a couple things to think about. Next week, again, we have same time. It'll be Wednesday, 9 a.m. Pacific, which I believe is 6 p.m. Central European time. There's a link here for joining VODAN. These slides will be posted on the website where you registered. There's also this welcome for the training of trainers. There's as part of the for data, which joins, oh, I'm sorry, we've got another participant coming in, which joins CODATA, GoFair, RDA, and WDS. VODAN and RDA COVID-19 working groups have a partnership, so this is how to get involved in the more policy aspect. And I wanted to highlight a new resource that we haven't talked about yet. This one comes from the curated list at the westbigdatahub.org, which Melissa, Alyssa, and I are all a part of. And that's the Data Science COVID-19 resources, which is at academicdatascience.org/COVID. And we do have a Slack channel. If that is your preferred method of engaging, that's at gofair.slack.com. So with that, let's, well, one, thank you so much, Mirjam. And we can open it up for questions.
Hello, can I ask a question?
Oh, good morning. Please, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Attenkut. I'm attending from Germany, from University of Greifswald. Just have some questions on the presentation. First, I would like to thank the presenter. It was a really wonderful presentation. And we are recently involving on fair data principle, mainly on medical domains. And I just have one question, I could say two questions. The first one is, can you a bit elaborate what exactly do you mean human and machine readable data? Just to give, you can give us some examples so that we can precisely understand those concepts. And the other thing is, you have already said quality data is important for verification and other processes. So can you explain a bit on the interdependency between data quality and FAIR principle? Exactly what is the impact of one over the other? Thank you.
Shall I take questions one by one, or do you want to take more questions first?
Oh, Mirjam, please go ahead if you want to speak to Attenkut, and apologies for mispronouncing your name. His questions, you know, what do you mean by machine readable data, and then the relationship of data quality to fair data?
Yes, so machine readable data in RDF in a form that can be found and handled by the machine. The metadata fair, the Internet of Fair Data and Services also remains an important, requires that it's also understood and accessible through human processes. So we really have both a coded part and a human readable part in the metadata, and they are two parts of the same coin in the context of the metadata. And the quality data, the way in which I see it, but I think that this is something that perhaps is a discussion. For me, when I use this term quality data, then these are data that can be engaged in such a way that we can understand where they are coming from. And so quality data to me are data where once we do the data analytics and there are certain things that we find, we're able to trace them back to their origin, and we can engage whoever related to that context. We can engage colleagues in the understanding of those data. And this is something that I think the fair data really provide for. And that also means that the elements that allow specific variables that may differ between contexts, that we can engage those more in the context of our work. So in my view, the localization of data, the distribution of data contributes to the quality of data. That is the way in which I intended that. But thank you for that question. It's a very good question. And perhaps you or others have a different view, and I would be also happy to hear that.
Let's see. Any other questions? Otherwise, I have a few of my own.
I have a question.
Oh, please.
My name is Esther Ter Inau. I am a PhD student at the University of Greifswald in Germany. My question is, there are a few countries that have been chosen to pioneer the setup of fair data points, if I understood correctly. My question is, why were these particular countries chosen? Was there already a favorable underlying infrastructure, or what was it?
Mm-hmm. That's a really nice question, Esther. I think that the choice really also shows how all of this is a social process. It just is the case that we had already done quite a lot of work within the context of these countries. We are lucky because we have Mirjam, who is also in this call, as a PhD student on this project. So it just really allowed us to move ahead fast, because the relationships were very good. We had a very good working relationship with the hospital, with the Ministry of Health, and so on. And that's really what you need in order to advance. But I mentioned those countries because I wanted to be clear where, in the first instance, we are focusing. But we think that we will have the fair data point ready in the next weeks, and we are already looking at expanding and involving others. So this is not at all closed, and you're really, really very welcome. And that's also why I was really happy that I was invited to give this talk. The more we are, the better. One thing is that I can say, and people from our network on the call, they will confirm that, is that we are taking ourselves through this process step by step. It's also a discovery, because we have very many different disciplines that need to come together. So what we hope we'll be achieving in the next weeks and months is that we are getting much more packages in a box, so that in a way I could just send you the specifications for a fair data point and almost without too much training, you can take yourself through it. In the context of our project, we also felt, and again this is based on the my personal experience in relation to the Ebola crisis, but also based on some research that we had done, is that there really is a need to strengthen the capacities, because you can put up an infrastructure, but without the data stewards, it is not going to be that meaningful. So again, the development here needs to go hand in hand with understanding from the administrative level what we're trying to do, and that the accessibility really is something that needs to be and has to be contextualized. But on the other hand, that we also do need to build the capacities, and hence we're working so closely with our sister universities to make sure that we have the data stewards. And actually that is the case everywhere. That is as much the case in the Netherlands or Germany or Belgium as it is the case in in Uganda or Ethiopia. But we published 2 articles, and well, Christine was one of the authors, and Mirjam did a lot of the groundwork for that. And what we found was that the uptake of fair data implementation was very fast in the last 3 years, but it was very much concentrated to 2 particular regions, Europe and the United States, and it was also very much concentrated in one domain, and that was the domain of the life sciences. So that was something that worried us, because we thought that even for the life sciences, if you have a whole continent not included in these data, it is actually going to be affecting, and then I'm going to use that word again, the quality of the data, because we need to have the diversity in order to really know what our data represent when we do our research. So that background of the research that we did on implementation and the identifying the weaknesses in that also informed our determination to make sure that we would do everything possible to engage our African colleagues in the establishment of the fair data points.
Mirjam, I was wondering if I could ask you how you came to be involved in your work in Africa. I know we heard last week from Baron Mons, who his own research had been on malaria, and he had spent a lot of time in Africa, and that was how he found his way to some of his interests in doing things differently with data, as you describe, leaving the data in Africa and have it owned locally where it was produced. But I wonder if you could comment a bit more on how you came to this area of research.
Thank you. That's a really nice question. I actually got involved because I had been working on Europe international relations and Europe-Africa relations for a really long time. But by around 2009, I was working in relation to the Horn of Africa, and I was being alerted of a very particular problem, which had everything to do with a new form of human trafficking, which was completely driven on the use of mobile phones, which had then just been introduced. And well, we ended up it's too long a story to go into detail, but we ended up doing quite a lot of research on that. And so what I realized from that is that innovation is good. Very often we think of innovation being good per se, but I learned from that experience, and which was quite a difficult experience, I realized that really innovation is context specific, and whether or not it is good really depends on that particular situation, and you can't avoid that. And so I became very interested in that relationship between digital innovation and context. And that is why, well, going back to that earlier question on quality data, it has to be determined in terms of the meaning that can be given within the context of where they were produced or where they are supposed to have meaning. And that doesn't take away the need for interoperability, because well, we have become a very small world, and COVID-19 makes that so clear. So we are really looking for a balance in which we are trying to, well, we are looking for a way in which we can balance, on the one hand, disconnected worlds, and on the other hand, the fact that this always is translated in a specific way, in a particular context. And it's that awareness that I think is so critical. And so when I was introduced by Barend in 2016 to FAIR, and I was already working on data science, but I was quite concerned and quite worried about the way in which the power of data can be such an important tool, but what is not in the data is just as important. And so that awareness of what we know within the data and what we don't know within the data is just so important for us as scientists to understand what these data represent. And so therefore I was really taken by the fact that a fair data point can be as small as a very small clinic somewhere in the north of Uganda, in Kitgum or Lira, whatever. It doesn't really matter. There where these data are available and there's somebody who's interested in making them interoperable, this can connect and can then link us back to that specific reality. And so that is why I became an ambassador of FAIR, because I felt it deals with critical issues. And then, again, I was just really so shocked with, what happened in the context of Liberia was that we were having a meeting with our research group. And the one administrator of the critical public hospital in Liberia happened to be at that meeting. And he got a message on his phone of the first Ebola patient. And we were in this meeting sitting in Tilburg, and we were saying, you need to go home. And so that night he went home. And then it took us about 6 months for the international community to respond. And then so much knowledge and capacity was brought in, and that was a good thing. But then when this was over, nothing remained, not even the data. And that just to me made no sense. So I really felt we have to do this different, and we have to do this differently. But that means that the question of ownership is really very, very critical. And it can never be just a technical project. It always has to be a technical project and a political project and a social project and a knowledge project. And all of that needs to come together. And that is, I think, why training of trainers is really vital, because by doing that, we take ourselves through the learning question where everyone in our own experience and discipline comes together to add weight to what are really the priorities within a given community and defined by that given community.
Thank you. I'm so glad I asked. I wanted to, if I may, ask one last question before we close this out. I want to comment to let you know that we have, in addition to people representing fair data stewards and people who would like to contribute around the globe, in the US we have participants from our National Institutes of Health. We have people who have their own consulting practices, people from research libraries, and they have all been interested in advancing capacity of FAIR in the US, including creating training materials and helping where they can. They're also good resources for connecting in others who are ready to help. So my question to you, Mirjam, is how can we help, especially knowing that some of these materials that are needed for VODAN-Africa could be reused here in the US? So help us know how to plug in.
Yeah, certainly. I think because many of the tools that we are working on, they can really be shared, as long as the respect is there, that everybody needs to kind of tailor that to their own purpose within the community as they have defined it. We need to really make those tools, and we also should not remake tools that already exist. So I would really be very grateful for our community to connect to your community in the United States, as we are also connecting to the European community and to those that have already started in Asia and Latin America. So definitely, so whether this is on communication, whether this is on training manuals, whether this is on kind of packing the technical aspects into ways that become more accessible for data stewards to then take that forward, all of that will be really, really very welcome. And it's necessary. I mean, we don't know what the situation is going to be, but we are really very worried on if the COVID-19 epidemic would really become anything as big as it is now, unfortunately, in the US and in Europe. It will be a real challenge if it would take those forms on the African continent, where people are often living in such closed areas and on top of each other and so on. So, yeah, we really need that kind of a support, and thank you for offering that.
Sure. So hopefully those of you who saw the website where you registered, there is a link to VODAN-Africa. There it has already a repository of training materials. Everything they've produced is there. There's also the Open Science Framework website has some of these other materials if you join VODAN-Africa. And there's a very vibrant group on WhatsApp if you really want to be plugged in and discussing things blow by blow. Sorry, I'm using idioms as they occur. That's another great place. And so if all else fails, please get in touch with us and we will make sure you're connected in. Mirjam, thank you so much for this very interesting, appreciated talk. I look forward to the day when we can be together again in the same room, but until then, this was quite wonderful. And thank you everyone for your time and attention. We will post this very soon to the website.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.